Good evening. After the success of our two prior events exploring lessons from history and geopolitics in the formation of modern Greek identity as a homage to the bicentennial from the Greek Revolution, we're on to our third event, in which we go back to more familiar territory and explore the continuity of Greek identity in the legacy and enduring role of monuments, ancient, medieval, and even modern. As many of you may know, one of the foundational raison d'etre, reasons for being of our society, of SPGH, is the importance of monuments, not simply as reminders of thousands of years of historical and cultural continuity and sources of inspiration, but also their present-day reception, the efforts and sacrifices of modern-day Greeks and Philhellenes in preserving them, but also their enduring practical, so to speak, functionalities, as for example, in the case of churches, holy sites in general, and icons. SPGH has preserved and revived in whole or in part many of them. The manuscript library at the monastery of St. John the Theologian in Patmos, where actually trained monks in modern techniques of manuscript conservation, friezes and sacred objects in Osios Lukas Monastery, the refectory and the monastery of St. Catherine in the Sinai Peninsula, and the historical neoclassical Plaka House. Last but not least, in 1995, when Richard Holland was member of the board of SPGH and I was a young acolyte back then, we played a central role in the historical repatriation to Greece of the Aidonia treasure of Mycenaean gold. Now, there is a direct link between monuments and 1821. And it is in one of SPGH's mottos, a passage from the legendary General Makrigiannis Opus Vitae, where this really manifests itself. This Opus Vitae is Apomnemonevmata, or my memoirs. The general says, I had two beautiful statues, a woman and a boy prince, and they were intact. You could even see their veins, such a perfection they had. Some soldiers had seized them and wanted to sell them to certain Europeans for 1,000 thalers. Then I took the soldiers to the side and spoke to them and told them, for those, even if they give you 10,000 thalers, you should never let them take them away from our land. For it is for those marbles we fought this war. So, according to one of its protagonists, the revolution of 1821 was not only about freedom, it was also for the great monuments, and of course, the Greek identity attached to these monuments. In this evening's lectures, Professor Sharon Gerstel will discuss her long-term project concerning the restoration of an 11th century village church in Mani in Bambakas. The study of the church is a fascinating story that starts in the medieval world and ends in the present day, and I'm sure it will continue for time to come. Not only as a monument, but obviously also as a source of meaning. It's a church, as a place of worship, it's a church, but also, as you will see, as an organizer, as a hub for the community around it. I recall Gary Vicken, the legendary director of Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, was talking about an icon, I believe it's St. Nicholas, and how Greek American visitors would often kneel in front of it, cross themselves, and kiss the icon to the annoyed eyes of museum guards who would run to admonish the visitors turned pilgrims, but without any hope, of course, that the one party would exactly understand where the other was coming from. Gary actually had said something to the effect that this presumed museum item got more kisses than he would have ever in his life, even if he lived 10 lives long. That's the paradigm. Professor Gerstel, coming now to tonight's speaker. Professor Gerstel is director of the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture, professor of Byzantine Art and Archaeology at UCLA, and the George Kolovos Family Chair in Hellenic Studies. Trained in art history, religious studies, and archaeology, Professor Gerstel focuses on culture based on artifacts and rituals, and in fact has branched to fields as fascinating as the acoustic experience in Byzantine churches. I bet some of you saw this beautiful article at the Atlantic a few years ago featuring her work on the acoustic side of monuments. Professor Gerstel has been involved in numerous excavations in Greece, both as a field director and as ceramics expert. She has also worked hard to preserve medieval buildings in Greece. For her multiple contributions to the promotion of Greek culture, she has been inducted into the Order of the Phoenix, named the Commander. That's one of Greece's highest honors bestowed upon her this past June. Importantly, she has been naturalized as a Greek citizen, which, as she told me during the reception at the ambassador's house, has been an even greater honor than receiving the medal itself. Without further ado, I will pass you on to Professor Gerstel. Sharon, you have the podium.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen and you'll be able to see my images. But thanks so much for your very warm introduction, both today and the warm conversation we had at the embassy, and for the wonderful opportunity to present to you this evening some of the work with which I'm currently involved in Greece. Ladies and gentlemen, every Greek, whether in the homeland or in diaspora, is closely tied to a chorion, a place, whether physical or spiritual, that represents family, roots, and land, a place that embodies identity, a place that can evoke the pain of loss, but one that also offers belonging, continuity, and return. For many in diaspora, passing this epic notion of chorion in its broadest sense onto our children is as vital as passing on such Hellenic concepts as philotimo, or the bravery to say ochi. As a trained Byzantinist, my work for the last 30 years has largely focused on choria, particularly in the Mani, in the very south of Greece, where I'm now a citizen. I have written extensively about the region and have helped raise funds from Los Angeles to pay for the restoration of buildings in the region, including the Church of St. Nicholas Tricambanos in Castagna, which you see on the screen. In medieval villages like this one in Messenian Mani, churches, sometimes 3 or 4 in a village, served and continue to serve as agents of faith. But too often in this and other regions, because of depopulation over the decades, such churches, the offerings of extended families and small communities, have been left to decay. And yet, each of these churches, seen individually, presents a story about people, primarily those who lived in rural areas, those whose stories have not been sufficiently factored into our history, even though their stories will be familiar to many of you from those of your own families. For the construction of this church, for example, a pious individual provided an ox, much the same way as we would donate money to our local church. The study of these churches raises important issues about what we value as a people. How do monuments like this one factor into a greater narrative that we construct about our Greek history, a history that interweaves threads spun over millennia? How do such buildings factor into the construction of a national identity intentionally rooted in a moment and a monument of the ancient past? Well, today I would like to introduce you to one tiny but very important church Ai Theodori, which you see on the screen, Saint Theodore, in the upland village of Vamvaka, Mani. And I'd like to think collectively about the meaning of this church in terms of village, regional, and even national identity. But I'd also like to consider more broadly our obligations, mine as a scholar and as a Greek, and ours as those committed to the preservation of Greek heritage, to save this and other similar structures. Such a conversation requires me to tell you just a little bit about the history of this building and the communities that used and continue to use it. So Ai Theodori is one of 12 churches, the majority of them Byzantine, in Vamvaka. Of these, it is the only medieval church that is not in ruins or rebuilt with modern walls. In family terms, it was the last of its generation to survive. The dome structure, marked in red on the satellite view, is sited on the main road of the village at a high point above the dwellings. Continuing above the church to the east, that is above Kotronaki, the road leads high into the hills where the villagers once had fields and kalivia, seasonal huts. As the local priest observed to me about its location, Ai Theodori is the crown of the village. It is close to the mountain to which people took their animals and from which people were nourished. And indeed, many of the threshing floors in the upper part of the village are in fields close to the church. Well known for its dated inscription naming the prolific medieval sculptor or Marmaras Nikitas, you can see here his name, Nikitas Marmara, Ai Theodori draws tourists from many other places to the village. Woven into the church's fabric are names associated with the village's unwritten history, names that are no longer remembered or even read. The issues that surround the study of humble buildings like this one are universal. How churches serve as containers of memory, how they participate in intersecting liturgical and agricultural rites, how they accommodate life cycle rituals, and how the buildings, both epigraphically and acoustically, record and shape words and sounds. Through the agency of the church, human time is transcended. The present is linked to the past, and generations of the faithful, both living and dead, are collected in common and eternal prayer. Indeed, for modern villagers, transtemporal connections are embedded in narratives about the church, whether referring to its construction, as one person says, the church was built by older generations, they carried the rocks on the back to build the church, or to its emotional value. As another said, it has come down to us from our grandfathers, our fathers. We've been living with it, and our children are also living with it, and our grandchildren live with it as well. Within small villages, and in the absence of preserved land registers, churches like Ai Theodori serve as archives of village memory, recalling those buried in close proximity, honoring those who offered financial assistance for construction or renovation, identifying the clergymen who served, recording significant events, and welcoming those who crossed the threshold in faith. In the Mani, dozens of churches like Ai Theodori are today in ruins. Their rapid decay offers a challenge to an office of the Archaeological Service that is already heavily taxed. At the same time, the restoration of monuments of historic importance and aesthetic value like Ai Theodori offers hope for the sustainability of small agrarian villages in the region, which has suffered from economic depression and depopulation. The few permanent villagers understand the importance of their church, which contains the first dated inscription of the famous medieval sculptor. They think about heritage tourism, which, in their opinion, has the potential of increasing income and growing the population. Indeed, those who live in Vamvaka are well aware of other churches that have been restored in the region and the benefits that restoration holds for assembling communities for church festivals, baptisms, marriages, etc. Like all churches in the Mani, Ai Theodori is built of stone, some freshly quarried for the construction and some repurposed from other sites. Stone has special resonance for the people who live on this rocky peninsula. It is the material of houses, churches, graves, cisterns, threshing floors, and all other built features. In this arid region, stone is the material of life. Within this church and others in the Mani, stone yields to nature and is carved into the forms of plants and animals. Sadly, in Aitheodori, stone also nourishes life as plants now penetrate the sandy mortar, reclaiming the interior of the church and covering the medieval paintings with a thin mantle of woven roots. The dedication of the church is significant in the Mani and speaks to individual and community connections. Theodore the General and Theodore the Recruit were powerful warrior saints, and the frequency with which they are honored in the region is linked by many residents to the bellicose nature of the Mani's inhabitants, those residents of an unconquered land who have always been known for their military valor. Theodore is a common name in this remote setting, a region where male infants are called opla or dufekia. In the medieval Mani, the frequent dedication of churches to military saints also signals their summoning in times of political and military strife. The siting of Aitheodori at a high point in the village suggests that the builders were aware of the saint's strategic powers. Indeed, the church's clear view of Tigani, the region's medieval administrative and military center, locates Aitheodori within a network of monuments and villages that could communicate with each other at times of danger. Yet the dedication to the Theodori holds another meaning as well, which is also revealed by the church's location. Turning south in front of the church, the road narrows and meets the current village cemetery. A dirt road leads beyond this to the older cemetery, which is long abandoned. According to the residents of Vamvaka, Aitheodori served as the funerary church of the village. Some even remember the existence of graves around the building, although burials have only recently been attested. Aitheodori and the newer cemetery with its long rows of stone tombs and larger family ossuaries were and are ritually linked through rites of burial. The deceased blessed in the church was carried along the narrow road to the cemetery, accompanied by mourners. Saint Theodore the Recruit is also associated with the remembrance of the dead through his evocation on the third Saturday of the Souls. The dedication of the church thus proclaims its centrality to the community of the living, but also to that of the dead. It involves the saints in issues of security through the evocation of holy protection, and it binds those baptized in the name of Theodore and their families to the saints. In 2017, the church was the site of a baptism, the first to be held in 70 years. Because of the church's fragile condition, the rite was held outside under the shade of an olive tree. Of the family members who were present, the father of the child was a Theodore, and the grandfather, the son of a Theodore. The child's great aunt, Metaxia, the elderly Maniatisa to the left, was tightly bound to the saints by a vow, as you will see shortly. The names of these contemporary villagers are woven into the modern life of Aitheodori, but their names extend backwards through the repetition within families and through sustained connections between this church and the adjacent cemetery, the annual celebration of the Saturday of the Souls, and life cycle rituals like baptisms and funerals. The church is tightly interwoven with personal identity, but also with village identity. The church is also located in close proximity to the ancestral tower houses of prominent village families. For them, the church was and is an intermediate station between their houses and the cemetery, a path that is still frequently taken as relatives visit the graves of the deceased to light lamps and offer prayers. Yet, like so many churches in the Mani and elsewhere, Aitheodori also has absorbed the names of those ancients who once walked across the same landscape, those who joined the medieval and modern residents of Vamvaka through their eternal commemoration on the walls of the church. In this church and several others in the Mani, stone and paint are in dialogue as names of local villagers, ancient, medieval, and modern, form part of an archive whose records are prominently displayed on interior and exterior walls. Reading the preserved names introduces us to an entire population, contextualizing people in their own temporal and physical surroundings and in the times and places that would follow. The inscriptions at Vamvaka also witness connections across villages, both along the mountain road and across the valley, that shared resources and family ties. On the exterior of the Vamvaka church, prominently placed adjacent to the entrance, a Greek epitaph of the 2nd century AD, placed upside down, proclaims Theophande here, Avhi here, Epitapsi here. Read against the illuminated facade, the inscription draws the modern viewer into the past, whether they can decipher the inscription or not. The names of the 3 deceased individuals supplement those recited within the walls of the church in the diptychs of the living and the dead, those remembered on the Saturday of the Souls, and those recalled in the nearby cemetery through commemorative prayer. And of course, the word here is a word familiar to all the faithful. The careful display on the church facade adjacent to the portal signifies the importance of words that were, across generations and for different reasons, highly significant. The ancient inscription on the west facade is counterbalanced by a fragment from a marble tomb monument or ossuary container immured on the east wall adjacent to the apse. Here too, the builders selected an ancient fragment whose decoration, like the display of the word here on the opposite side of the church, would resonate with medieval viewers. The marble relief is carved with a portal flanked by 2 Ionic columns. But the horizontal and vertical beams that divide the portal into 4 panels appear in this setting as a cross. Ai Theodori houses yet another ancient name covered up until recently, when I finally really well swept the floor of the church. The name is inscribed on a small Hellenistic grave marker of the late 3rd or early 2nd century BC, which was carefully trimmed and incorporated into the white marble pavement near the threshold of the sanctuary. The text records the name Philodame and ends again with the word here, farewell. The careful positioning of the text, visible across time, and the marble plaque with the cross united ancient, medieval, and modern communities in a shared language of salutation and commemoration. Inscriptions in Vamvaka also capture other generations that passed through the village. These generations are closer in time and united by faith, the generations that gathered the stone to build the church and also left their names to be remembered. Above the main portal is a limestone beam carved with peacocks, flanking a foliate cross. On the left side of this composition is an inscription written in 4 lines, today cracked by the weight of the belfry, which was rebuilt in the early 20th century. The text reads, "Remember, Lord, your servant Theodore the priest, and Kali, the builders of this holy monastery." Located on the same wall as the ancient funerary inscription, this text provides us with another set of names to associate with the building, another set of identities. The name of the priest Theodore forms an additional connection through name and profession between the saint and an individual, and then between the individual and the Theodores who still pray in the church. This connection between the past and present was clearly manifested during a service held in the building in 2017 as part of a collaborative project to film a short documentary about the church. The village priest, Father Nikolaos Lambrinakos, was invited to celebrate a short liturgy in the church, the first Trisaion to be held in many years. Before the service began, I took the priest around the church and read with him the medieval texts inscribed on the lintel and on one tie beam inside the building. I want you to listen in for just a moment to how he chanted this Trisaion.
Ελέησον ημάς ο Θεός κατ' το μεγαλαιό σου, δεομεθά σου επάκουσον και ελέησον. Έτσι δεόμεθα υπέρ αναπαύσεως την δική του δούλου του Θεοδόρου, ιερέως αδερφού και σύντρογου γενομένου, Καλλιόπης πρεσβυτέρας και Νικήτας.
So in his prayers during the service, Father Nikos spontaneously asked the Lord to grant salvation and the remission of sins to Theodore the priest, my brother and concelebrant, Calliope his wife, and Nikitas, the marble sculptor. Time collapsed as a contemporary priest ritually concelebrated with a priest who had died almost a millennium earlier. In his prayer, Father Nikos called the priest's wife by the name Calliope, even though she's recorded in the inscription as Kali, a common name for women in the Middle Ages in this region. Of course, Calliope is a popular modern name in the Mani and elsewhere, and in changing her name slightly, Father Nikos introduced the medieval presbytera into contemporary society. 2 years after the Trisaion, the priest was still evoking the name of his medieval concelebrant. In conversations I had with him in October 2019, Father Nikos repeatedly referred to Theodore the priest, stating that, quote, he was drawn to the church because of this connection. Inscriptions over the portals of churches in this region and elsewhere help us to repopulate villages and reimagine communities of the past. They inform us about the roles that these small structures played in the lives of those who built them, entered them, and prayed within them. They tell us about the motivation of church patrons for undertaking such constructions and their reasons for venerating specific saints. These inscriptions are the manifestations of vows made, marking the church exterior with the words of prayers and making permanent requests for assistance. And on occasion, inscriptions inside the church do more than manifest the votive wishes of the faithful, as we see in the text incised into the marble tie beam. And you can just look, here's the inscription that runs the entire length of the beam here. The third name recalled in prayer by Father Nikos was that, of course, of Nikitas, the marble sculptor, whose name you've already seen carved into the architectural decoration of Ai Theodori and many other churches in the Mani. Nikitas' traces can be found in inscriptions that bear his name and in his distinctive style of carving. Like the inscription on the exterior of the church, the inscription on the tie beam begins with the word remember, linking the text overhead in terms of the process of memory, under a scientific process, to the one above the portal. Here, the Lord is asked to remember thy servant Leo and his wife and children. The text thus adds another set of names to those already connected to the building by faith. Continuing, the Vamvaka text praises Leo for his great devotion, which provided these sculpted embellishments, and then instructs the chanters, and you can see the word here, Ipsalondes, right here, to pray for him. Thus, when Father Nikos added his chant to that of an 11th century priest, he was in fact following instructions that had been carved above his head, fulfilling a mandate left by the hand of a medieval sculptor. While the interior of the church at Vamvaka was originally painted with images of saints, narrative scenes from the life of Christ, and dogmatic images concerned with the incarnation and resurrection, these are now covered by whitewash quite recently. The church has at least 3 layers of paint, a 13th and 14th century layer, and an earlier layer that is no longer visible. In the apse of the church, as you can see, are post-Byzantine paintings. Scratched into the north wall of the church, above and between the faded images of equestrian saints, are graffiti that record later events that concerned the church and its community. Of paramount importance is a graffito which reads, in the year 7046, that is the year 1537, the Turks plundered the Mani. I'm very grateful to Panayotis Katsafados for deciphering this text for me. The text provides critical information about incursions into the Mani, that unconquered land, at the time of the Third Ottoman-Venetian War in 1537 to 40. In the year 1537, the date of this inscription, the Ottoman Admiral Barbarossa Hayreddin Pasha sacked Agios Dimitrios, Paliochora, the capital city of the island of Kythera, and carried off numerous hostages. residents of the Mani quickly learned about the Turkish threat to Kythera and about the ensuing siege of the island. Indeed, according to a Venetian report of 1563, refugees from Kythera found their way to Mani following the stunning defeat. Close to this graffito is a second one naming Papa Vasilio, Father Vasilios, a 16th century priest whose name can now be added to the list of clergymen who served in Aie Theodori, Theodore, Vasilios, and most recently, Father Nikos. Aie Theodori at Vamvaka is a humble structure, yet it exemplifies how village churches served as monumental stone archives, enshrining within their very fabric the names and memories of those who lived and were buried in close proximity. It was built in 1075, but it gathers generations from millennia before and after. Like so many churches in the Mani, it navigates between the living and the dead. It is painted, but whitewashed, solid, but eroding. It is the church of a village, but it's also the church of an empire and of a modern nation. It records for us sounds and captures emotions, lamentations over the deceased, fears of invasion, etc. Because of the importance of its inscriptions, its fixed date, and its association with a known marble worker, Aie Theodori is one of the best-known medieval churches in the Mani. It is included in books on Byzantine architecture as an exemplary structure, but it's crumbling. It is hard not to connect the depopulation of the village with the abandonment and decay of the building. But does it really need to be like this? Like many churches in the Mani, Aie Theodori also participates in the lives of contemporary villagers who value its heritage but are frustrated by its condition. In June 2016, I attempted 3 times to enter the church only to find it locked. By accident, I met a local councilman, Stamatis Pandaliakis, and his wife Kyriaki, who related their concerns about the church's condition. They urged me to have a look at the church, and they arranged for its caretaker, Metaxia Anaplioti, to meet me with the key. Metaxia, too, was anxious about the condition of the church, since a thick crack runs through the south wall and a tree was growing out of it. Many of the 11th century glazed bowls that had once decorated the church exterior had been broken or pried from the masonry. Wasps had been built nests against the marble lintel of the west portal and elsewhere on the building. And because of damage to the roof, especially because of the large number of missing tiles, rain was penetrating the structure and damaging the vaults, and the icons had been covered with plastic in order to protect them from the water. Roots had descended into the church. So shortly after my visit, I posted something about it on Facebook, and lo and behold, I had a telephone call from the director of the local office of the Ministry of Culture, who asked me to help raise funds to restore the building. And a nonprofit corporation has now been formed in the United States for this purpose. Those who live in Vamvaka and the surrounding villages have strong feelings about the importance of the church, both as a heritage site and as a center of Orthodox rites. The church evokes complex notions about identity, and especially in a region like Mani. Irini Pandaliaki Exarhaku, who grew up in the village before moving to Glezu as a bride, remembers that until 1950, the church was used for funeral rites. When she was a child, she was taken to services in the church. They were all sad services, she observed. They didn't have coffins then, so they laid the deceased out on planks of wood. And if the dead person was young, there was a great lament, and the women would tear their hair, and they would carry the deceased in their arms and then to the cemetery. The whole village went to the church and then followed the procession to the cemetery. Manolis Tsigakos remembers the Epitafios procession stopping outside the church on Holy Friday, where there were women gathered with candles. Stamatis Pandaliakis, who climbed up the outside of the church to ring the bell in his youth, remembers christenings and funeral services when he was around the age of 10. When he was around 15, he asserts, the liturgies stopped and the church was abandoned. He knows the land around the church intimately and can point out the remains of cisterns and discuss property ownership. He remembers that the interior was once decorated, but that someone went in and painted over the saints, an observation that was repeated to me by many villagers. How did such an important church fall into such a perilous state? According to the villagers, the abandonment of the church was hastened by a change of priest in the 1950s. The new priest from the neighboring village of Mina favored the recently built church of the Panagia in the lower part of the village. As one resident commented, the priest was not interested in using Ai Theodori. But an event that took place in the early 1980s also contributed to the church's abandonment. Nearly every older person in Vamvaka, and even those outside the village, remember a robbery that took place within the building. Michalis Exarchakos remembers his father telling him that a robber, a foreigner, had dug inside the church and stolen fragments of sculpture. Yet another villager recalls that the robber, a German, ran out of the church so quickly that he left his pickaxe and shovel behind. I still have them. The marble fragments were placed in the pavement of the church as best we could. But the resulting pavement, as you can see, continues to be extremely unstable. The story is related with great excitement by the villagers, who were proud of thwarting the robber, who was eventually captured by the police. And the emphasis on the robber's German origins plays well in the village, where value is placed on those with blood ties to the region. Care of the church fell to Metaxia Anapliotti, whose connection to the saints through a vow ensured that she entered the building daily to light a candle. Her family's tower house is in close proximity to the church, and undoubtedly she felt a connection to the building, which was located in her neighborhood. Occasionally, tourists were able to enter Ai Theodori, but accessibility in recent years was dependent on Metaxia's schedule and her health. Many left the village without ever entering the church. Father Nikos's flock is the community of faithful that is connected through memory to those who built the church and those whose names are inscribed on it and in it. The residents of Vamvaka acknowledge the importance of the Saints Theodore, since every family in the village has a member who shares their name. The villagers frequently mention generations gathered in the church, and they feel a kinship to those whose names, both ancient and medieval, are inscribed on the facade and on the interior. Village identity is tied to the fate of this church. It is for this reason that Michael Exarchakos has written letters to multiple prime ministers, asking them, begging them to allocate funds for the church's restoration. The connections are deeply personal. When human bones were uncovered outside the church in the course of excavations in October 2019, Father Nikos asked to say Thrisayon for the deceased and offered to place the bones within his own family ossuary, saying, "They are one of us." The church ties the villagers to their past, but also to their future. It binds the elderly who reside in the village and the youth who visit annually. Thus, after careful planning, I returned to Vamvaka in 2017 to collaborate on the production of a film about the church and the community. Engaging in this endeavor a colleague, Katerina Zacharia from Loyola Marymount University. We interviewed a number of residents of Vamvaka, including a Greek American, Dimitrios Pandaliakis, the head of one of the most important families in the village, and a lawyer from West Springfield, Massachusetts. Honoring the tradition of ritual lament in the Mani and connecting it to Metaxia and the church, we worked to create a traditional song that would appropriately describe the efforts to save the church and Metaxia's important role as its caretaker. Let me share with you a short clip from that song, sung in the regional cadence by Mrs. Kula Panagiotopoulou.
Μες στις Βαμβάκα στα χωριά, του Άι Θοδόρου τα φθένα, στεκέται η μεταξία μας, η πιο πιστή του φύλακας.
The words refer to Metaxia and her vow to Saint Theodore and calls her the most faithful guardian of the church. So, fulfilling my promise, sufficient funds were raised to pay for the study of the building. And we were very lucky to be helped in this effort by the architects Klimis Aslanidis and Christina Pinazzi. And in 2019, as you see, excavations around the building undertaken by the Directorate of Antiquities demonstrated that the foundations of the building were solid, but that damage had occurred when stones supporting the soil around the slope, church built on a slope, had been removed. Missing stones were found inside and outside the church, indicating that whatever damage the building had endured could still be repaired. And we were able to chemically match the sand used in mortar, which derives from a nearby cave known only to locals, which has supplied sand for centuries for constructions in this area. The plan is to now build a platform, one that will support activities of the community, but will also structurally bolster the building. And after repairing the structural issues, the aim is to restore the icon screen as it was in the 11th century when it was first carved by Nikitas. And this includes the replacement of two fragments, which you can see on the lower right of the screen, from the chancel screen that are currently located carved side up at the top of the new bell tower. Of course, all of these repairs require funds, and this is where the film comes in, a film that is intended to raise awareness of the plight of this church and its community. Ai Theodori provides a wealth of information about the history of a village for which there are few written accounts. Bringing together the names of the past and the voices of the present allows us to consider how a community grew up around the church. Its preservation until this day affirms the church's value to the community, those who once repaired its walls and rebuilt its belfry, and those who trimmed the tree growing from its side and light candles in remembrance. It is a monument rooted in loss, marked by the tombstones of the ancients, and linked to the adjacent graveyard by right and proximity. The inscriptions, both ancient and medieval, are dominated by two words, farewell and remember. And it is the second word, remember, that brings us into communion with the church as villagers and as visitors. But what about Metaxia and her vow? On February 13th, 2018, a cold, wintry night in Mani, Metaxia's house caught fire, and she perished in the flames. Since the church key had melted in the conflagration, Ai Theodori remained locked for months. It was not until June when I arrived in Vamvaka that the lock was cut off and I was able to enter the church. No candles had been lit in 4 months, and the interior of the church felt unnaturally still, as if it too had died. The lock from the church was buried in Metaxia's grave, and her body was eventually covered with gravel, the stone from this harshest land that would comfort her in the next world. And tragically, exactly 3 years later, Stamatis Pandeliakis, the village councilman, in a time of pandemic, succumbed to pneumonia. He who started my story with the church did not live to see the completion of the project. My dear listeners, there are many ways to express identity as Greeks: food, traditions, beliefs, shared history, shared challenges. But within the village, our common village, it is often these churches, buildings animated by prayers of individuals and communities, buildings that reenact the past, and buildings that house rites of passage. It is often these churches that bind us together. We see this now manifested in the construction of the St. Nicholas Shrine, a focal point in New York where local, national, and even international communities will gather. And we see this in small villages across Greece, the ones to which we in the diaspora return every summer. Here in churches that were historically the center of communities, modern day villagers still gather. And here, as in New York, if you save the church, if you pass it on to the next generation, you save the Chorion. And this work, this preservation of the past for future generations, the preservation of the physical manifestation of identity is for me the ultimate act of philotimo. Thank you, and may the memories of Metaxia and Stamatis be eternal. Thank you for listening.
Sharon, thank you so much for everything, and for a very, very moving story of people, real people, whose fates are inexorably linked to that living monument. You bring together place and time in a synthesis that's actually nothing less than transcendent. In times where our lives are totally non-transcendent, we live for the moment sometimes, we live for the trivia, and you bring a totally different paradigm to life. So one question, and it's a very general one, is if we follow the moral of your story, such a powerful story, do we have hope that by raising consciousness, making people more aware of what Ai Theodori hold inside and everything else like Ai Theodori, it's not only that we can preserve a monument or a line of scholarship, but we will actually enrich people's lives, increase a sense of meaning, and perhaps we will hope that we're going to raise better people in the future. What is the possibility that there is a deeply human, a deeply, if you want, pedagogical element to this unbelievable narrative of yours?
I mean, I think we all have these stories inside of us, all of us who work and live in Greece. We have these connections to these special people and special places that are outside of our normal existence, shall we say. And I think if we can connect to what for me is the essence of Greece, if we can connect to this essence, to the past, our common past, through these stories, it empowers us for the future. I think it's a very important message to give, not only to scholars. This is well beyond the field of my scholarship. I think it's an important human message. And I wish every church in the United States, every organization would adopt one of these communities and recreate, re-energize these very important and special communities that really belong to all of us. We're all part of them, and they should be part of us as well.
Again, one more comment, and then I will pass it on to Sophia. This is a remarkable version of archaeology, your version. You know, people often see the study of the past as being an activity coming from our times, inserting itself into the passing of time, into the past. But what you're doing here is you take all this and you reinsert it back into our lives. And in fact, also projecting it forward. This is truly remarkable, not only for the sake of your discipline scholarship, but for the broader good.
Thanks. The book that I'm working on right now is about a series of maniatises that I've met over the years, each, including Metaxia, each more extraordinary than the next. And it's these women, these very humble village women, the strongest women I've ever met, who really inspire me. I'm looking at the comments in the chat. I wish every Greek child could go to Greece and sit by the feet of these women and learn about resilience, learn about strength. And these are things that we, especially in diaspora, we don't encounter those characteristics anymore. And so I think if I had my wish, I would take every school child with me to see, to encounter these people, to embrace these buildings, to re-energize these communities, because these communities they represent for us core values, not only for Greeks, but for humans in general. So I think to reconnect with these people and these issues is very important for all of us. It's at least the lesson I hope to pass on to my students, to my child, to whoever encounters this story.
Thank you so much. We need to get back to that in the future event because this is huge. This is very important. This is very important. Sophia, we'll
Yeah,
turn
I'm going to go
on to
to
you
some
now.
questions in the chat. The first one is from Professor Kostis Toregas. He's asking, have you thought of motivating Greek youth to learn basic observation techniques and then record, as you have done, these wonderful monuments that are decaying by the hundreds in countless villages? We are running out of time, I would say, and your work is so inspirational.
I would love to do that. I take my own students to Greece every year to do exactly this, but I think this is something that could be embraced more broadly in a kind of pilot program by the community, to take high school students even learning Greek to Greece. These students are so far more advanced than we are in making these films. I think it would be so impactful for them. And it seems to me we have the makings of a wonderful pilot project that maybe we could collaborate on to bring children to Greece to do just this.
Awesome. Thank you. The next question is from Ellie Ganelin, who says, wow, what an inspiring story, weaving our shared identities with the past and present. What drew you to this village in Mani?
That's a very touching question. I first went to the village a few weeks after my own father had died, and I went into the church to light a candle and encountered Metaxia there. And I realized her situation and I wanted to give her some money. Of course, as a Pradmanyata, so she would never take it. And so I gave her enough money to buy a year's worth of candles for anyone who would walk into the church. But it was from that moment of encounter with her that I recognized there was something very special about the story of the village and the engagement of the villagers. And then slowly, I began to meet everyone in the village, including the lawyer from Massachusetts, who's now a very close friend, whom I cold called in Massachusetts and said, I'd love to stay in your house. And he said, I'm not going to let you stay in my house. I will host you. And I have a better grill that I brought from America than any grill in Greece. So very quickly, I became very close to the villagers. And it's a place that I now spend a lot of time on in the village. It's a very special place. But as I said, very depopulated, as many villages, not only in Mani, but throughout Greece. And I think that's the issue, is that this film is about one church, but it could be a film about hundreds of churches and communities that have been abandoned. And I think that's the important thing to think about.
Thank you. And then I had one last question. What is the latest on public interest in Greece, including governments, institutions, organizations, etc.? One of the challenges is that Greece has so many sites to preserve, so each one needs their own advocacy. How do you see that playing out?
I think that's true. And I think, as you all probably know, one of the greatest problems is how to transfer funds to Greece for such projects. There's no easy way to set up corporations here, nonprofits, and send the money to Greece. So I think the government needs to understand that I think there is an interest, there could be an interest of communities here of sponsoring restoration or cleaning. It's not all that expensive, but they need to be able to facilitate that. Of course, part of the problem is that the money in Greece, which is limited, goes into major tourist sites. It's it's the return warrants the investment. But the only way to re-energize and repopulate the countryside is to actually think about targeted investment in these areas, not to build garish hotels and lure people to beaches, although of course there are beaches, but to bring people in an encounter with their past. And I think to have a past that's so powerful and so special is incredibly impactful for people.
And I did have a follow-up question on mobilizing students and youth. I mean, you talked about bringing students from the US. What about Greek students? What are you seeing being done from a Greek educational perspective? Is
I
that
think I think that's an interesting question. I actually spoke this year in a cultural heritage class in Greece. And so I think the students there are quite interested in following up in this. I think it just needs to be formalized. But I think Greek students are increasingly interested in looking at these small villages. And you'll notice that in the past few years, there have been many, many films released about the plight of the villages. So I think we're at this moment where people are looking beyond Athens to see what is authentically Greek. And that often refocuses people's views on the Choreo. And I would say no place is more authentically Greek than Mani, in my view, as a Maniatisa.
all right, I'm going to take a few more questions from the chat. This is from Jim Birakos. In Mani, the past and present are inseparable. Professor Gerstel's work keeps the memories alive. How can we contribute to Agi Theodori?
So I left an email at the end of the film, but you can contact the Niarchos Center at UCLA and I can put you in touch with how to make a contribution. More easily done in Greece than here. But we're at that moment of thinking about finalizing the funding for this project.
Awesome. And then there's another question that's popped up by William Pragos. Sharon, do you think Greeks would have maintained their respect of their past had their modern history been easier, or is that their past so powerful they cannot avoid it?
As always, a very interesting question from Mr. Pragos. I think every Greek is so rooted in the past they can never escape it. That's my honest view. It's bred in the bone. It's one of the special characteristics of Greeks.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions that I have and that I seem to see from our audience. But Professor Gerstel, thank you so much. This was such a lovely conversation. Thank you so much for your work. Vasily, I'll let you make
I would like to, just to conclude this. There's actually more comments I see popping up, but these are just congratulatory words or words of awe and enthusiasm. Sounds to me like you've hit a nerve here, actually a good one. The chord, it's musical, what you've hit. It's terrific. It is unbelievable how revolutionary ideas come out of this sort of thing from culture and monuments, and Sharon just brought it, made it alive, just brought it, put it on the table. Thank you so much. I would like to say we don't say farewell. We will get back together and talk some more about this, not just as a sequel to what's going on with Agi Theodori, but with the whole project and the whole idea, actually, which is more important perhaps than the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you in Washington
Oh,
at some
absolutely.
point in the future.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Right. Let's do it live.
Let's do it live. Okay.
Goodbye, everyone. And thank you again, Professor Gerstel.
Thank
Have
you.
a nice evening.
You too.